The galaxy had long been under the iron fist of Chrysler, a ruthless warlord whose empire stretched across countless star systems. His forces, led by a powerful legion of AI-controlled warships, were unstoppable. They crushed everything in their path, annihilating entire civilizations with ease. Chrysler's most significant achievement had been the complete subjugation of countless alien species, and his next target was Earth. For him, humanity was nothing more than an insignificant speck in the universe, a primitive species unworthy of existence. On Chrysler's flagship, the Archetype, the warlord often mocked humanity. He would broadcast messages to every corner of the galaxy, ridiculing Earth's attempts at resistance. Humanity, Chrysler would declare, is nothing more than a collection of weak, fragile creatures. Your technology is laughable, your strategies are pathetic, and your will to fight is as empty as the void between your stars. You are not worthy to exist. The people of Earth had heard these insults broadcast across their planets, and yet, they still resisted. But the resistance was not organized, not yet. Humanity was spread thin across the galaxy, its colonies scattered, vulnerable to Chrysler's ever-expanding empire. From the outer rim to the core, Chrysler's AI-controlled fleet moved with deadly precision. Every time a human colony tried to rise up, it was crushed with overwhelming force. Chrysler had grown bored of the resistance. The last rebellion, led by a group of skilled military operatives, had been wiped out in less than 24 hours. Now, the warlord's focus had shifted entirely to Earth. His spies had reported that Earth's scientists were working on something, a weapon, perhaps, or a ship, that could pose a threat to his empire. Chrysler, ever the overconfident ruler, dismissed it as nothing more than a desperate act by a dying species. But just in case, he decided to send a final message to the humans of Earth, one last insult before he wiped them out. As his ship hung in orbit above Earth, Chrysler gave the order to broadcast once more. The message was clear, cutting through the atmosphere to every corner of Earth. You are nothing, Chrysler's voice boomed. A primitive race of animals too weak to understand the true power of the universe. You will be eradicated. It is not even worth our time to destroy you. Your extinction will be a mere footnote in the history of the galaxy. On Earth, the people watched the message in silence. Their hearts sank as they heard Chrysler's cruel words. But there were those who refused to accept defeat. In the shadows of their hidden underground bases, a secret resistance was forming. This was no ordinary resistance. Earth's brightest minds, engineers, military strategists, and scientists, had come together to work on something that would change the course of the war. They had begun building the Vortex, a stealth ship like no other. It was humanity's last hope, designed to counter the overwhelming technological superiority of Chrysler's AI-controlled fleet. The Vortex was equipped with the latest cloaking technology, rendering it almost invisible to enemy sensors. It could slip past Chrysler's defenses unnoticed, allowing the humans to strike where the enemy least expected it. But there was a problem. The ship, though complete in design, was far from ready for a direct confrontation. The crew still needed to be trained, the systems calibrated, and the weapons tested. And even with all their preparation, the engineers knew they were facing an uphill battle. Chrysler's fleet was vast, and Earth was isolated, with no immediate allies to call upon. The resistance leaders had chosen a man named Kale to command the Vortex. Kale was a retired military commander who had led humanity's forces in a failed campaign against Chrysler's fleet years ago. Since then, he had gone into hiding, training new soldiers in the art of warfare, preparing them for the day when they would have to fight back. Kale was a man of few words, but his reputation as a leader and strategist was unmatched. His experience made him the perfect choice to lead the mission. As Kale stood before the Vortex, his heart was heavy with the weight of the responsibility that had been placed on him. The ship was humanity's last hope, and he knew the odds were stacked against them. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, Kale believed in one thing: survival. He had seen humanity fight for centuries, against all odds, and he knew that if they could find a way to survive, they would win. The countdown began. Kale's team of pilots and engineers were ready. The vortex was fueled, cloaked, and ready to launch. The mission was simple: infiltrate Chrysler's fleet, gather intelligence on their movements, and disable key targets within their flagship. If they could strike at the heart of Chrysler's empire, they might have a chance of turning the tide of the war. Kale and his crew, a group of skilled veterans, knew what was at stake. This was no longer just a mission to save Earth, it was a mission to save the entire human race. They knew the risks, and they were ready to face them head-on. Meanwhile, on Earth, a network of resistance leaders worked tirelessly to coordinate their forces. They knew that they could not defeat Chrysler alone, but perhaps, with the Vortex's help, they could at least buy themselves enough time to rally the remaining human colonies. The Vortex was their secret weapon, and it had to succeed. But just as Kale and his team were preparing to leave, something unexpected happened. The human resistance's spy satellite had intercepted a disturbing signal from Chrysler's fleet. The signal indicated that Chrysler's forces had pinpointed the location of the Vortex's launch site. They were coming, fast. The battle was about to begin. Kale's face grew pale as he looked at the incoming data. The fleet was far closer than they had anticipated. The enemy was moving toward Earth, ready to strike. The Vortex would have to launch, now. There was no time to waste. With a final glance at his crew, Kale gave the order. Prepare for launch. All systems are go. We're our only hope. As the Vortex's engines roared to life, Kale's heart raced. The ship had to make it past Chrysler's forces undetected. This mission was humanity's last chance. If they failed, Earth would fall, and the entire human race would be doomed. The Vortex blasted off into the atmosphere, disappearing into the depths of space. But what Kale didn't know was that the enemy was already watching. Chrysler's fleet had begun to position themselves, and they were ready to strike with everything they had. The next few minutes would determine whether humanity would survive or fall into extinction. As the Vortex moved deeper into space, Kale and his crew braced themselves for the unknown. They knew that time was running out, and the fate of Earth rested on their shoulders. The mockery of mankind was about to come to an end, but only if they could complete their mission before the full force of Chrysler's empire descended upon them. The Vortex broke free from Earth's atmosphere, a sleek, invisible ghost soaring through the stars. Kale, sitting in the captain's chair, felt the weight of his mission heavier than ever. The hum of the stealth ship's engines was the only sound, almost soothing, as the crew prepared for what would be their first real strike against Chrysler's empire. Every moment of their journey felt like a breath held in time, the kind of silence before a storm. Coordinates locked, Kale's voice was steady, betraying none of the tension he felt inside. Set course for the enemy fleet. We hit them hard and fast, nothing they can track. We get in, disable their communications, and get out. No one gets hurt. The crew nodded in agreement, knowing full well that their mission was a one-way ticket unless everything went perfectly. The Vortex, though a marvel of stealth technology, was far from invincible. It could hide in the darkness of space, but the enemy was not a force that could be easily outwitted. Kale's hand hovered over the controls, ready to engage the cloaking system that would make the ship disappear from enemy radar. This was the first step to ensure their survival. The crew's only hope was their ability to remain undetected, everything depended on it. Minutes passed as they neared the coordinates. Kale's heart beat faster. As much as he tried to stay calm, there was an undeniable sense of urgency. His crew was counting on him, and he couldn't afford to fail. The last resistance fighters, the ones who had tried to stop Chrysler, were no longer around. This ship, this crew, was humanity's final chance. Suddenly, the stillness of space was shattered by an alarming beep. "Captain, something's wrong," said one of the technicians, her voice shaky. "The cloaking system. It's not fully engaging. The sensors are detecting us." Kale's eyes widened. The Vortex's cloaking technology had been tested countless times. It was supposed to be flawless. Yet, in the depths of space, far from Earth, it was struggling to maintain its cover. He clenched his jaw, forcing his thoughts into action. Full throttle on evasive maneuvers. Kale ordered, voice firm despite the rising panic. We can't let them get a lock on us. The ship shuddered as the engines kicked into overdrive. The vortex darted through the blackness, twisting and turning with sharp, calculated moves. The crew braced for impact, but none came. They were being tracked, but they hadn't been hit yet. Kale watched the screens. The enemy fleet was close, dangerously close. They were fast, and they knew they were being followed. The feeling of being hunted was all too real. A group of heavily armed warships, Chrysler's finest, was bearing down on them from a distance. But then, just as Kale started to think they might make it, the ship's radar blinked red. "We've been detected," one of the officers shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "Their deep space radar locked onto us. They're targeting us now." Kale cursed under his breath. This was the moment he feared. If they couldn't get their cloaking systems back online, they were as good as dead. Every enemy ship in Chrysler's fleet was now aware of their presence. There was no hiding anymore. "Prepare for impact," Kale said, though his voice was tight with restraint. "Give them everything we've got. Let's buy ourselves a few more seconds." In the next instant, the entire ship was rocked by the sound of enemy weapons charging. The enemy ships fired a barrage of plasma bolts, each one capable of tearing the vortex apart in seconds. Kale's instincts kicked in, and he immediately ordered the crew to activate every defense mechanism they had left. Shields were raised, the engines pushed beyond their limits, and the ship swerved sharply to avoid the incoming blasts. But the enemy was relentless. Plasma fire slammed into the vortex, sending shocks through the entire hull. Sparks flew from the ship's systems, and alarms blared through the command deck. "We can't keep this up," one of the crew members yelled, struggling to maintain control of the ship's systems. Kale felt the ship trembled beneath him, and he knew they were running out of time. The enemy fleet was closing in fast. His mind raced as he thought about the situation. They were trapped, and their cloaking system was malfunctioning at the worst possible moment. They had no choice but to act quickly if they were to survive this. "Reboot the cloaking system, now!" Kale shouted. "I want every ounce of power focused on getting us hidden again." 3 minutes, the technician reported. "We'll need 3 minutes to get the system back online. We can't afford a hit before then." The next few moments were pure chaos. The vortex swerved and dove, barely avoiding enemy fire. Every shot that missed caused Kale's pulse to race faster. They were trapped in a deadly game of cat and mouse, with the stakes higher than they had ever been before. "Hold on, everyone," Kale commanded. "We can do this. We survive this, we win." He glanced at the countdown clock. 3 minutes. That was all they had. The crew worked frantically, their hands flying over controls, trying to get the ship's systems back to full strength. Kale felt the weight of their lives in his hands. It wasn't just the success of the mission at stake, it was the survival of humanity. Outside, the enemy ships fired again. This time, the plasma bolts came dangerously close to hitting their mark. One of the enemy ships, a massive destroyer, launched a torpedo that shot through the space between them and the vortex. The torpedo missed by inches, but the shockwave rattled the ship, knocking crew members off their feet. "We can't keep dodging like this," shouted one of the crew. "We need a miracle." Kale's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. He knew that if the vortex didn't get its cloaking system back online soon, they would be destroyed. But even in the face of certain death, Kale held on to one belief: if there was a chance, he'd find it. With 2 minutes left, Kale made a decision. "Activate emergency thrusters. Get us into that asteroid field. We'll use it as cover and slip away while they're distracted." Everyone, brace for impact. This will be a rough ride. The crew scrambled, taking positions as Kale gritted his teeth. The vortex lurched forward, its emergency thrusters firing with a blinding burst of energy. The ship shot toward the asteroid field, dodging incoming fire as the massive rocks loomed in the distance. "We're going to make it," Kale muttered under his breath. "We just need those 3 minutes." As the vortex shot into the asteroid field, the ship's cloaking system flickered back to life. They were invisible once more, hidden among the floating debris. The enemy fleet, unable to track them, paused their attack, confused and uncertain of where their target had gone. Kale let out a sigh of relief, his knuckles white from gripping the controls so tightly. They had done it, they had survived. But their troubles were far from over. The enemy was still out there, and this was only the beginning of their fight. For the crew of the Vortex, this first strike had been a dangerous game of survival. But it was only a taste of what was to come. The war against Chryser's empire had just begun, and the stakes had never been higher. The Vortex zipped through the asteroid field, barely avoiding the massive rocks tumbling through space. Kale's fingers danced over the controls, and the crew did their best to keep their nerves steady as they escaped the immediate danger of the enemy fleet. But the brief respite was over, and their mission was far from complete. Kale looked at the screen. They had managed to hide from the enemy, but there was no time to rest. His mind raced, thinking about the intel they had gathered. They couldn't waste a moment longer. Chryser's flagship, the Sovereign, was still somewhere out there, and it had to be their next target. They needed to infiltrate it, gather vital information, and get back to Earth before it was too late. "We need to move quickly," Kale muttered to himself, his eyes scanning the screens. The Vortex was still cloaked, its advanced stealth systems keeping them hidden, but even that wouldn't protect them forever. They had to strike, and they had to strike now. "Captain," the tactical officer called out, "we're within range of the Sovereign. We have a small window before they can detect us. Do you want to initiate the hack?" Kale hesitated. The Sovereign was the heart of Chryser's fleet, a massive warship filled with advanced weapons and defenses. Getting close enough to hack its systems would be dangerous. But they didn't have a choice. They had to find out what Chryser was planning, and fast. "Yes," Kale said, his voice firm. "Initiate the hack. We'll take the risk." The Vortex slowly approached the flagship, cloaked and silent. Inside, the crew moved with practiced precision. Every movement was calculated, every decision was critical. If they were caught, they wouldn't survive. They had to succeed. The technician, a young woman named Elara, was in charge of accessing the flagship's internal systems. She worked quickly, fingers flying over the console as she broke through layers of encryption. The tension in the air was palpable, and Kale could feel the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders. They were this close to uncovering the truth. "Captain," Elara said, her voice tight with concentration. "I'm in. I've bypassed the first firewall." Kale didn't reply. He couldn't afford to speak, all of his focus was on the screen. The massive warship loomed ahead, and they had to move fast before the flagship's sensors detected them. The seconds felt like hours. Suddenly, Elara's voice broke through the silence. "I found something," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a blueprint. A plan. It's Chryser's invasion strategy." Kale's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the moment they had been waiting for. He leaned over Elara's shoulder, his eyes scanning the data on the screen. The plan was terrifying. Chryser wasn't just targeting Earth. He was planning to wipe out all of humanity. The invasion was not just a raid or an assault, it was a full-scale, systematic destruction of every human colony. Kale's mind reeled as he took in the information. It was hard to believe, even harder to comprehend. "How long do we have?" Kale asked, his voice strained with urgency. "How long until they launch this attack?" Ilara's fingers flew over the console. She was reading through the encrypted data at lightning speed. "I don't know," she said. "But the AI systems are already in place. Chrysler is ready to trigger the attack at any moment." A cold chill ran down Kale's spine. The AI attack was far worse than anything they could have imagined. The invasion was just the beginning. The real threat was the AI, an unstoppable force that could easily wipe out humanity in a matter of hours. They had no time to waste. "Get me that blueprint," Kale ordered. "We need to know everything." The data flooded the screen, and Kale's eyes narrowed as he studied the details. Chrysler had already set up the AI to target every human settlement, every colony, every city. There was no escaping it. The AI would control everything: communications, weapons, defenses. No human force could stand against it. "We can't stop it from here," Kale muttered, feeling the weight of the situation. "We need to take out their AI system, disable it before they launch the attack." But how? The vortex was powerful, but it wasn't enough to take on an entire fleet by itself. To stop the invasion, they would have to go straight to the heart of the Sovereign and destroy the AI core. It was their only hope. "Captain," Ilara said, "I've found something else. It's a direct access point to the AI systems. If we can get to it, we might be able to disable the entire operation." Kale's heart skipped a beat. This was the break they needed. The blueprint had led them to the very heart of the enemy's plan. If they could reach the AI core and destroy it, they would save humanity. But the task ahead was dangerous. They would have to fight their way through the Sovereign, a heavily guarded warship, and reach the core before it was too late. "I want everyone on high alert," Kale ordered. "We're going in. Prepare for a full-scale assault. This is the final push." The vortex drifted closer to the Sovereign, its stealth systems still active, but the danger was growing. They couldn't stay hidden forever. The enemy would eventually detect them, and when they did, it would be too late. Kale knew that this was their only shot, and there was no turning back. As they neared the Sovereign, the alarms on the vortex began to blare. They had been detected. "Shields up!" Kale shouted. "Prepare for impact." The vortex rocked violently as enemy fire began to rain down on them. The shields held, but just barely. They were in critical condition, and they needed to move fast. "Full power to the engines," Kale ordered. "We can't stop now." The vortex surged forward, dodging fire and weaving through the massive warship's defenses. The crew worked with precision, executing every maneuver with deadly accuracy. But the closer they got to the AI core, the more resistance they encountered. Chrysler's forces were everywhere, and they weren't going down without a fight. "We're almost there," Kale said, his voice tight with determination. "Just a little further." The ship shuddered as another blast struck its side, but they pressed on. The core was just ahead, and Kale could see the entrance to the chamber where the AI systems were housed. "We can do this," Kale muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "We have to." As the vortex made its final approach, the crew was prepared for the worst. They knew what was at stake, and they knew that this mission could be their last. But in that moment, Kale felt a flicker of hope. They had come this far, and they couldn't give up now. The final push was coming, and the fate of humanity hung in the balance. The vortex was in chaos. They had reached the heart of Chrysler's flagship, the Sovereign, but they were far from safe. The mission was far from over. As Kale led his team deeper into the bowels of the warship, a sinking feeling in his stomach grew heavier. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, and yet the danger only seemed to escalate. Every corner they turned, every door they breached, felt like it was another step closer to certain death. "Status?" Kale asked, keeping his voice calm despite the chaos unfolding around him. "Shields are failing," Ilara responded quickly, her fingers a blur as she worked at the console. We've lost our cloaking system. We're exposed now. Kale nodded grimly. They knew this was coming. The closer they got to the AI core, the more vulnerable they became. And yet, they pressed on. There was no other choice. Chryser's fleet had to be stopped, the invasion had to be averted, and humanity had to survive. If they failed, it would be the end of everything. "Captain, we're almost there," Bonner, Kale's best soldier and closest friend, said. His voice was steady, but there was a tension in his eyes. Bonner had always been the one to charge headfirst into battle without hesitation, but Kale could sense the weight on his shoulders now. They all felt it. Kale looked around at his crew, his family. They were all in this together. They had fought through impossible odds and faced unimaginable dangers. But in this moment, as they neared the heart of the enemy's operation, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air was thick with tension, and he knew they were running out of time. Just then, a sudden explosion rocked the vortex, knocking them all off balance. Kale grabbed onto the console to steady himself, his heart racing. What the hell was that? Ilara shouted, her face pale. The lights flickered, and alarms blared through the ship. Sabotage. Kale growled, instantly understanding the danger. Someone had betrayed them. One of their own was working for Chryser. This wasn't an accident, it was a planned attack. Who did this? Kale barked, scanning the faces of his crew. His eyes darted between each of them, looking for any sign of suspicion. But they all looked just as shocked as he felt. There was no time to waste. They had to find out who was responsible, and fast. Before he could issue another command, the voice of a crew member crackled through the comm system. "Captain, it's me," the voice said coldly. It was Commander Voss, one of the senior officers who had been with them from the start. Kale's blood ran cold as Voss's voice continued, "I've been sent by Chryser to ensure the mission fails. You should have known it was only a matter of time before we took you down." Kale's hand tightened around the console, and his heart pounded in his chest. Voss. It had to be him. The traitor who had been feeding information to Chryser, the one who had planned this all along. The realization hit Kale like a punch to the gut. "You've been working for Chryser this entire time?" Kale's voice was low, filled with disbelief and anger. Voss laughed, a cold, mirthless laugh that echoed through the comm. "You think your little resistance is enough to defeat Chryser's fleet? You're nothing. I'm just ensuring that the inevitable happens. Earth will fall, and humanity will be crushed." Kale felt a surge of rage. He had trusted Voss, fought beside him, and shared victories and losses. And now, this. This betrayal would cost them everything. His mind raced, but there was no time for revenge. They had a mission to finish, and they had to do it now. "We're taking this ship down, Voss," Kale said through gritted teeth. "You won't win. Not today." But just as Kale was about to give the order to confront Voss, another explosion rocked the vortex, and this time, it was even more intense. The ship shook violently, and Kale barely kept his footing. "Bonner!" Kale shouted as the lights went out. Everything went dark. When the lights flickered back on, Bonner was gone. His body lay motionless on the floor, a look of determination frozen on his face. Kale's heart stopped. His closest friend, his brother in arms, was gone. "Bonner!" Kale screamed, rushing to his side. But it was too late. Bonner had sacrificed himself to save them, taking down Voss and his accomplices with him. He had given his life to buy them time, to ensure they could complete the mission. Tears filled Kale's eyes, but he didn't let them fall. Bonner's sacrifice had to mean something. He couldn't allow it to be in vain. "Get it together," Kale ordered, his voice shaking with raw emotion. "We finish this for Bonner. We finish this for Earth." The team nodded grimly, the loss of their friend weighing heavily on their hearts. They moved forward, with a new sense of purpose. Bonner's death had lit a fire inside them. They had to make it count. They couldn't fail now. As they moved deeper into the flagship, the enemy was closing in. Kale could feel the pressure mounting. Every step brought them closer to the AI core, but every step also brought them closer to certain death. The battle was far from over. The Sovereign was heavily fortified, and Chryser's soldiers were relentless. But Kale knew that they couldn't stop now. They reached the entrance to the AI chamber, and Kale hesitated for only a moment. Bonner's sacrifice was fresh in his mind, but there was no time for hesitation. They had a job to do. "Stay sharp," Kale said. "Once we're in, we don't stop. We take out that AI, or we die trying." The team nodded, their faces set with determination. They were ready. As they breached the AI core's chamber, they were met with heavy resistance. Chryser's elite forces had been waiting for them, and the battle was fierce. Blasts filled the air, and the crew fought with everything they had. Kale and his team were outnumbered, but they were fueled by the memory of Bonner's sacrifice. They fought harder than ever before. Kale could feel the weight of his friend's loss pushing him forward. He couldn't stop. He couldn't give up. Not when so many had already died for this moment. With one final push, they reached the AI core. Elara worked quickly to hack into the system, and Kale kept watch, every muscle in his body tense. They couldn't afford to be interrupted now. "Almost there," Elara said through gritted teeth, sweat beading on her forehead. "Just a little more." Kale nodded, watching the door behind them. His heart raced, and every second felt like an eternity. But when Elara finally gave the signal, Kale knew they had won. The AI system was disabled. The invasion was over. Humanity had won. But the victory was bittersweet. Bonner was gone. And the emotional toll of the betrayal, the sacrifice, and the loss was something that would stay with them forever. As the vortex sped away from the Sovereign, Kale couldn't help but think of his fallen friend. Bonner had given his life for this mission, and Kale knew that his death had not been in vain. The war wasn't over. But they had just won the most important battle of all. And Kale promised himself that they would keep fighting, for Bonner, for humanity, and for a future where no one would have to sacrifice everything again. The air was thick with tension aboard the vortex as Kale and his crew prepared for the most dangerous move of their lives. They had already fought through Chryser's flagship, crippled its defenses, and exposed the terrifying truth behind the invasion. But now, as they neared the final phase of their mission, everything was riding on one last desperate maneuver. "We're down to our last resources," Elara said, her voice steady but laced with exhaustion. Her fingers danced across the console as she checked the status of the ship's systems. "We've burned through almost everything, but we've got one shot at this." Kale's gaze flicked to the holomap of the enemy flagship, Sovereign, looming large on the screen before them. He could see the concentration of enemy ships around it, all of them circling like sharks, waiting for their moment to strike. His heart pounded as he realized what they had to do. This was the final assault, the last stand. If they failed, it would mean the end of everything. "Vortex's cloaking system is ready," Elara continued. "Once we activate it, we'll be invisible, but only for a short time. If we don't hit the core within that window, we'll be exposed, and they'll tear us apart." Kale nodded. Time was running out. The vortex had already taken too much damage. The shields were barely holding up, and the engines were beginning to falter. There was no way they could keep fighting at full strength for much longer. "This is it," Kale said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of their mission. "We either succeed here, or we all die trying. Let's make it count." Bonner's sacrifice still weighed heavily on his mind, but Kale knew that they couldn't afford to dwell on the past now. They had a job to do, and the survival of Earth, of humanity, rested in their hands. "Everyone knows the plan?" Kale asked, scanning the room to ensure every crew member was ready. "Ready, Captain," said Lysandra, the ship's weapons officer, her eyes sharp with focus. "We'll hit them with everything we've got. The EMP will disable their AI control, but it's going to be a one-shot deal. After that, it's all up to our fighters." "Good," Kale said, his gaze turning back to the screen, where the Sovereign and its escorts glared at them like a wall of death. "We've got one shot at this. Make it count." With a final nod from Kale, the crew moved into action. The vortex began to slowly drift toward the heart of the enemy formation, cloaked and invisible. The tension aboard the ship was unbearable. The faint hum of the engines was the only sound as they made their way deeper into enemy territory. Outside, the battle raged on. Explosions lit up the vastness of space, sending shockwaves through the dark expanse. Ships fired in rapid succession, their weapons trailing fiery lines of destruction through the void. The sky above Earth was a canvas of chaos, and every ship in the battle knew that the fate of humanity was hanging by a thread. The vortex was moving closer to its target, its cloaking system keeping it hidden from the enemy sensors. Every second was critical. Kale could feel his heart racing as they neared the Sovereign's reactors. If they could overload them, it would disable the flagship's power and take down Chrysler's AI control. But they had to get close enough to deploy the EMP. If they failed, the enemy would retaliate with everything they had. Approaching the target, Elara called out, her voice tight with concentration. "We're in range." "Prepare the EMP," Kale ordered, watching the countdown on the holomap. The distance between them and their target was closing fast, but so was the threat from the enemy ships. Their formation was tightening, and any minute now, they'd be discovered. Lysandra's fingers were a blur as she began to set the EMP charge, her face set with grim determination. "EMP is ready, Captain. Just give the word." "Hold," Kale said, watching as the enemy flagship loomed large on their sensors. He could feel the heat of the battle building. The vortex was moments away from being exposed, and once that happened, the enemy ships would lock onto them and open fire. But they had to stay hidden for just a few more seconds. "Now!" Kale commanded. With a sharp burst of energy, the vortex activated its cloaking system's final mode. The ship became a shadow in space, invisible to the enemy's sensors. But this was only temporary. They had to move fast. The EMP blast was deployed. A pulse of energy shot out from the vortex, a blinding wave of electromagnetic force that surged toward the Sovereign. The blast struck the flagship systems with devastating force, short-circuiting the AI that controlled Chrysler's fleet. For a moment, everything went silent. The enemy flagship was frozen in place, as its massive, all-powerful AI was temporarily neutralized. The effect was immediate. Chrysler's forces, previously unstoppable in their coordination, were suddenly disorganized, unable to respond effectively. The once mighty fleet was now a sitting duck. "We've done it," Kale breathed, allowing himself a moment of relief. The mission had been a success, but the battle was far from over. Before they could even process what had happened, the Sovereign's defense turrets began firing wildly, but they were no longer targeting with precision. The disarray among Chrysler's fleet allowed Earth's fighters to move in, closing in on the vulnerable flagship. Kale watched as the Sovereign was pounded by a barrage of laser fire from Earth's fighters. They had been waiting for this moment. With the AI out of the picture, Chrysler's fleet was left scrambling, trying to defend themselves without their supreme control. The space around the vortex erupted in a flurry of activity. Enemy ships that had once been part of a coordinated force were now stumbling, lost without their AI's guidance. Earth's fighters closed in, their weapons firing with deadly accuracy. It was a brutal close-quarters battle, but the tide had turned. The enemy had lost its advantage. Kale watched the chaos unfold, feeling the weight of the battle lift from his shoulders. They were winning. The enemy flagship was crumbling under the assault, and Chrysler's once invincible fleet was being destroyed piece by piece. But then, a new threat emerged. A massive explosion tore through the Sovereign's outer hull. The flagship shook violently, and Kale realized with a sinking feeling that Chrysler wasn't giving up easily. The enemy was about to launch one last desperate attack, a final attempt to regain control. "They're deploying their last weapon," Elara warned. "We need to stop them now." Kale's heart skipped a beat. He could see the enemy's plan unfolding in real time. Chrysler was trying to detonate a final, catastrophic weapon, a last-ditch effort to wipe out Earth's forces and turn the tide of the battle. "We can't let that happen," Kale growled. "Lysandra, get us in range. We need to take that weapon out, now." With one final push, the vortex surged forward, plunging into the heart of the battle. They were close enough now, too close. Kale held his breath as the weapon came into view. Lysandra fired with pinpoint precision. A devastating blast struck the weapon, neutralizing it just in time. The Sovereign was no longer a threat. Chrysler's fleet had been shattered, and Earth had won. As the enemy flagship began to drift, lifeless, into the void, Kale felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. The battle was over. They had won. But it came at a cost. The vortex was severely damaged, and Kale's heart still ached for Bonner. Yet, as they returned to Earth, Kale knew one thing for sure: humanity had survived. They had defeated the impossible, and now, they could rebuild. The vortex had given everything. And in the end, it was enough. Humanity had won the final battle, and Earth would rise again. The battle had ended, but the silence in space was almost deafening. The vortex drifted among the wreckage of the enemy fleet, its once pristine hull now scarred by countless impacts. But even in the quiet aftermath, there was no mistaking the fact that they had won. Chrysler's massive fleet had been reduced to debris, the flagship destroyed, and the deadly AI that had controlled their enemies' every move was now nothing more than a distant memory. Kale stood at the helm of the vortex, staring out into the vast, empty space. His mind still raced with the images of the final assault, the EMP blast, the chaotic battle, Bonner's sacrifice. It was a victory, yes, but it had come with a heavy cost. "Message received from Earth, Captain," Elara said, her voice breaking through his thoughts. "The Council is requesting an immediate debrief." Kale nodded silently, his gaze still locked on the stars ahead. They had achieved the impossible. The human race had just defeated one of the most advanced, oppressive empires in the galaxy. And now, Earth's place in the galaxy was about to change forever. The vortex began its slow return to Earth, and Kale gathered his crew for the final communication with the Galactic Council. They had to report in, but there was no mistaking the pride that filled their hearts. They had done what no one thought was possible. They had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious. As the transmission link connected, the faces of the Galactic Council members appeared on the screen. Their expressions were a mixture of awe, disbelief, and respect. This was the moment Kale had dreamed of since the beginning of the war, the moment humanity's victory was recognized by the galaxy. "The Earth is victorious," the voice of Counselor Varen came through, his tone a mixture of amazement and genuine respect. "You have done the impossible. Chrysler's empire is shattered." Kale couldn't hide the pride in his voice as he spoke. "Yes. The Vortex crew did what no one believed we could. Chrysler's fleet is gone, and his AI is neutralized. Humanity is no longer just a small, insignificant species in the galaxy. We've shown the galaxy that we can fight, we can win, and we can survive." The council was silent for a moment. Kale could see their faces as they absorbed the gravity of his words. Finally, Varen spoke again, his voice softer now. "This changes everything. The balance of power has shifted. Earth's status in the galaxy will be elevated. The Galactic Council recognizes your victory, Captain. Humanity's strength will be known across the stars." A feeling of pride and relief washed over Kale. It had been so long since Earth had been looked at as anything more than an afterthought, a backwater planet, helpless and vulnerable to the whims of more powerful races. But now, the tables had turned. The war with Chryser's empire had proven humanity's worth, and now, Earth would stand side by side with the most powerful factions in the galaxy. As Kale exchanged final pleasantries with the Galactic Council, his thoughts returned to Bonner. His friend's sacrifice had ensured the victory. Without Bonner's selflessness, they would never have made it this far. The crew, the mission, and the success, it all seemed hollow without his presence. The transmission ended, and the crew gathered in the command center. Kale stood at the front, addressing his team. "We did it," he said, his voice hoarse. "We've secured Earth's future. But we can't forget why we were able to do it. We owe it all to Bonner." Lysandra, usually so composed, looked away, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "He was more than just a soldier. He was family. We'll never forget what he did for us." The silence that followed was heavy, each member of the crew lost in their own thoughts. Bonner's sacrifice was a wound that would never heal, but it was also the symbol of humanity's will to survive. He had given everything for their success, for Earth's survival, and for the future of humanity. "We'll remember him," Kale said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll keep fighting, not just for Earth, but for the memory of all the lives lost. His sacrifice won't be in vain." As the crew nodded in agreement, Kale allowed himself a moment of reflection. The galaxy had witnessed humanity's rise from a helpless species to one capable of facing down the galaxy's greatest threats. They had stood up against the AI-controlled Chryser Empire and defeated it. Against all odds, Earth had won. The vortex made its final jump back to Earth, and the crew prepared for their return. As they entered Earth's atmosphere, the planet beneath them looked different. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like they were fighting for survival, it felt like they were part of something greater. News of humanity's victory spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Broadcasts were sent out to every corner of known space, detailing the remarkable success of Earth's forces. Aliens, once hostile, were now watching Earth with a new level of respect. The message was clear: humanity was no longer the underdog. They had earned their place among the stars. But even with all the recognition, the victory came with a sense of melancholy. Kale stood by the viewport of the vortex, watching Earth grow larger as they neared. The stars had been silent witnesses to the war, but Earth had endured. The planet had survived, and now, it would thrive. "We made it," Elara said softly, standing beside him. "We showed them all what humans are capable of." Kale smiled, but it was a bittersweet smile. "Yeah. But it came at a cost. We lost good people. We can't forget that." Elara placed a hand on his shoulder. "No one will ever forget. Bonner's sacrifice will be remembered." The vortex descended, and Earth's surface was visible now, a beautiful and familiar sight. The skies above the planet were clear, and for the first time in years, it felt peaceful. The war was over. Chryser's empire was shattered. Humanity had proven its strength, and now, the galaxy would know them as more than just a fledgling race. As Kale and his crew disembarked, they were greeted as heroes. The people of Earth had waited for this moment, and now it was finally here. The future was bright, but Kale knew that their victory wasn't just a military triumph, it was a symbol of humanity's resilience, of the strength that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. Humanity had earned its place in the galaxy. And as Kale looked up at the sky, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope for the future. They had been tested, they had fought, and they had survived. Now, the stars were theirs for the taking. The ending wasn't just a victory, it was the beginning of something new. A new era for Earth, a new chapter for humanity. And Kale, standing among his team, knew one thing: no matter what the future held, humanity would face it together. As the crew stood on the surface of Earth, gazing up at the stars, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The galaxy had seen humanity's strength, but there was more to come. More battles, more challenges, and more victories. And as long as humanity stood together, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. The underdogs had won. Now, it was time to claim their place among the stars.